fight for the unborn. Mississippi becomes the latest state to pass a heartbeat bill. We examine the trend across the country and why the law could end up in the Supreme Court. Threat from Tehran. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo continues his Middle East visit as the United States places new sanctions on Iran. Trip to Italy. China's president is in the Catholic country. We have a report from Rome on whether he is expected to talk with leaders at the Vatican. And drawing on his faith, a side of Pope Francis you may not have seen before. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, March 22nd, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. President Donald Trump says people will not stand for the Robert Mueller report if it goes against his presidency. Mueller is investigating Russian interference in the 2016 election. The report is widely expected to be delivered soon to the U.S. Justice Department.
There was no collusion, there was no obstruction, everybody knows it. It's all a big hoax. I call it the witch hunt. It's all a big hoax.
The president is also redefining the map of the Middle East. The White House says ISIS territory in Syria has been 100% eliminated. The president has been teasing this victory for days. Faith-based adoption agencies in Michigan, paid by the state, no longer will be able to turn away same-sex couples or individuals because of religious objections. The agreement was reached between the Democrat Attorney General and lawyers for the ACLU. Beckett, a nonprofit law firm which fights for religious freedom, says the decision means, quote, thousands of children will be kept from finding the loving homes they deserve. A Catholic priest in Michigan is acquitted of sexually assaulting 2 teens. Father Robert Dillard testified in his own defense and denied allegations. He faces 2 other trials. A Catholic diocese in Connecticut agrees to pay $3.5 million to 5 men who alleged they were victims of child sexual abuse. 2 of the 3 accused priests in Bridgeport have died. The 3rd was from the Maronite religious order. That order will pay the portion of the settlement. The Ohio Department of Health says it's ending grants and contracts that send money to Planned Parenthood. The move comes after a divided federal appeals court last week upheld the state's pro-life law blocking public money for the abortion provider. And in Mississippi, the governor signs a bill banning most abortions as soon as the baby's heartbeat is detected. Nearly 70% of both state chambers passed it. The new law is supposed to go into effect July 1st, but abortion groups are threatening to sue. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi tells us a number of states are passing bills just like this. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. It's the tale of 2 worlds. Liberal states like New York enshrining abortion up to birth, while states like Mississippi are pushing bills to ban abortions around 6 weeks of pregnancy. All eyes are on the U.S. Supreme Court and its new conservative majority. Both sides of this moral debate see Roe v. Wade as hanging in the balance. With the stroke of Mississippi Governor Phil Bryant's pen,
it is law.
The heartbeat bill becomes law. Take a look at this video shared by the governor.
The heartbeat has been the universal hallmark of life since man's very beginning. I can remember the exciting moments both with my children and grandchildren when the first sonograms were taken and that heartbeat could be heard.
This new Mississippi law will ban most abortions as soon as that heartbeat can be heard, with an exception if the mother's life or bodily functions are at risk. Pro-Life Mississippi's Laura Eaker says they're here to help parents.
We need to get the word out that there is help available for all these young women in the community through the church, through the pregnancy center, financial help, parenting classes. We're just not going to stop in the fight for all life.
The state joins Arkansas, Kentucky, Iowa, and North Dakota in approving this law. Courts ruled against those states, and abortion supporters promised to sue in Mississippi, too. The Center for Reproductive Rights says they're determined to rob Mississippians of the right to abortion, and they're doing it at the expense of women's health and taxpayer money. This ban is cruel and clearly unconstitutional. But Laura Eaker tells me this law is needed.
We still need to be in the fight, and any tiny steps are going to make a difference. I mean, eventually Roe's going to be overturned, and Mississippi is a pro-life state, and we need to make our views known.
The heartbeat bill is working its way through a number of other states. Ohio's Senate passed it, and the houses of both Georgia and Tennessee did as well. The bishops of Tennessee say it's not prudent to support the bill. They say it's already been struck down in other states, and it'll lead to costly lawsuits, with state money then going to pay legal fees of abortion groups. Lauren?
And Congress is out, and we know they're not doing much on this, right?
That's right. And even when Republicans controlled the U.S. House, they did not bring up the heartbeat bill for a vote. They did pass other bills like the 20-week abortion ban, but those bills never were able to get the 60 votes needed to pass the U.S. Senate.
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. A Catholic priest in Montreal was stabbed this morning while celebrating Mass. Father Claude Grew is expected to survive. Police say a suspect has been arrested. The stabbing happened at the city's famed St. Joseph's Oratory. 2 United States service members have been killed in Afghanistan. Officials tell CNN they died during a mission in the northern part of the country and likely as the result of enemy fire. The names have not yet been released. A Syrian teenager who survived a massacre at a mosque last week in New Zealand says he wishes he could trade places with his father and older brother, both of whom were killed.
If I'm dead and my brother and my father is still alive, it will be better.
14-year-old Zaid Mustafa says he and his late brother, 2 years older, were inseparable. Zaid is recovering from gunshot wounds suffered in the attack. 50 people were murdered last week in Christchurch after a gunman opened fire on 2 mosques. The Trump administration hits Iran with new sanctions. The announcement comes as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in the Middle East denouncing Iran's growing influence in the region. The secretary is also facing backlash after the president recognized Israel's sovereignty over the disputed Golan Heights. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby joins us with details from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Lauren, good evening. The deputy spokesperson for the State Department says the new sanctions aim to hold the Iranian regime accountable for their support of terrorism and to make sure Iran doesn't develop a nuclear weapon. The sanctions target 31 Iranian scientists, technicians, and companies. All this as Secretary Mike Pompeo arrives at his final stop of his week-long trip to the Middle East.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo sitting down today with Lebanon's president, prime minister, and with the Speaker of Parliament, warning the country's leaders to curb the influence of the Iran-backed Hezbollah movement. Pompeo says Hezbollah is a terrorist organization and should not have the ability to set policies or wield power.
The United States will continue to use all peaceful means, everything at our disposal, to choke off the financing, the smuggling, the criminal networks, and the misuse of government positions and influence that feeds Iran and Hezbollah terror operations.
But the group already has representatives in Lebanon's parliament. Earlier this week, the Lebanese president said U.S. sanctions on Hezbollah are harming Lebanon as a whole. Secretary Pompeo's message today is likely to get overlooked after President Trump's unexpected declaration yesterday. In a tweet, the president says, after 52 years, it is time for the United States to fully recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which is of critical strategic and security importance to the state of Israel and regional stability. Israel seized the Golan Heights from Syria in 1967, and it's been considered occupied territory ever since. Israel annexed the area more than a decade later, a move no country has ever recognized until now. Secretary Pompeo welcoming the president's announcement while he was in Jerusalem.
President Trump made a bold decision to recognize that an important decision for the people of Israel. It will truly be historic.
But not everyone agrees with the decision. The president of Turkey spoke out against it. President Erdogan saying the move has brought the region to the brink of a new crisis and new tensions. Syrian lawmakers also disagree, saying Golan is Syrian and Arab.
While the Trump administration is facing backlash in the Middle East, some conservative groups are praising the decision. Tony Perkins, the president of the Family Research Council, says, quote, under President Trump, the world sees and understands that the United States is a true friend and ally of Israel, and his words support are followed by meaningful and historic action. Lauren?
Wyatt, talk to me about how Catholic groups in the Holy Land are reacting to President Trump's announcement.
Officially, the church has not recognized President Trump's declaration. The Patriarchal Vicar of Jerusalem says this is a purely political issue. He says we respect the United Nations and the European Union's position. They still consider the Golan Heights to be occupied territory, and their position is one country cannot unilaterally change international law. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt. A cardinal in Venezuela calls on the country's military to disobey orders to use lethal force against civilians. Cardinal Baltazar Porras says disobeying unjust orders is both a right and a duty for security forces. The country remains in political turmoil. Yesterday, a top aide to opposition leader Juan Guaido was arrested, and that move drew condemnation from the United States and other allies. At least 95 people are dead after an overloaded ferry capsized yesterday in Iraq. Mostly vacationers were on board, celebrating both the Persian New Year and Mother's Day. The Holy Father expressed his condolences via a telegram released by the Vatican. It said in part, quote, "Upon the whole Iraqi nation, Pope Francis invokes the divine blessings of healing, strength, and consolation." Chinese President Xi Jinping received a red carpet welcome today by Italy's president. The two-day state visit is aimed at getting Italy to join China's Belt and Road infrastructure project. Alan Holdren, EWTN's Rome bureau chief, has more.
Lauren, Italian President Sergio Mattarella greeted President Xi in the Italian presidential palace. This afternoon, President Xi attended a wreath-laying ceremony at Italy's Monument for the Unknown Soldier. He's also attending a state dinner where Italian opera singer Andrea Bocelli will perform. The highlight of the trip will be tomorrow, when there will be the signing of a deal making Italy the first major democracy to join China's Belt and Road infrastructure project. The goal of both countries is to build cultural and economic ties. Italian media have been speculating about the possibility of a meeting between President Xi and Pope Francis, but so far there's been no word from either side. Earlier this week, the Vatican's Secretary of State said that the door is always open to dialogue. The Holy See and China signed a controversial agreement in September over nominations of bishops. We spoke with an expert on the church in China here in Rome today who says he doesn't expect a meeting to happen. He says that the relationship between Italy and China is too critical to risk a visit between China and the Vatican. China and the Holy See haven't had diplomatic relations for more than a half century. In Rome, Alan Holdren, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Alan. St. John Paul II's record on abuse is being defended by his former secretary, Cardinal Stanislaw Givich, says John Paul II had no intention of tolerating pedophilia in the church. Critics have said the former pope was sluggish to address claims of misconduct. For more on this story, including how St. John Paul II reacted to the abuse scandal detailed in the Boston Globe in 2002, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. Coming up, why the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference is against proposed changes to the Civil Rights Act. The chairmen of 3 committees of the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference are voicing their opposition to a bill that, if passed, would amend the Civil Rights Act to include sexual orientation and gender identity as protected characteristics. In a letter to Congress, Archbishop Joseph Kurtz of Louisville, Bishop James Conley of Lincoln, Nebraska, and Bishop Frank DeWayne of Venice, Florida say, quote, "The Equality Act would impose sweeping regulations to the detriment of society as a whole." Joining me now is Monica Burke, research assistant at the Heritage Foundation's DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society. Monica, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
We know that the bishops believe everyone should be treated with dignity. Everyone should be treated with respect. But they do list in this letter key areas of concern. And at the top, it says the Equality Act would regulate thought, belief, and speech. Does this proposed legislation impinge on the First Amendment?
That is absolutely correct. The bishops are absolutely right to be concerned about this legislation. We've seen state bills have a similar effect at the state level. For example, take the case of Peter Vlaming. He was a high school French teacher who, when he found out one of his students was pursuing gender transition, because of his Christian beliefs, declined to use any of the preferred pronouns. He just avoided pronouns altogether and agreed to use the student's preferred masculine name, but ultimately was fired from the high school for quote-unquote discrimination. And so we could expect to see more cases like this under the Equality Act, which would weaponize anti-discrimination law to punish people for their beliefs.
Let's talk about health care, because this would also have an effect on Catholic hospitals.
Yes, absolutely. And again, we've already seen this at the state level. So what the Equality Act would do is it would force doctors and nurses to perform and provide sex reassignment surgeries and other related procedures. It would force hospitals to offer them. We've seen 3 Catholic hospitals already have faced lawsuits for declining to perform these surgeries and procedures. In fact, one of those cases in Washington actually involved a 16-year-old girl who wanted a double mastectomy. And then insurers would be forced to pay for these procedures as well. So this would constitute another dangerous healthcare mandate.
The bishops describe a scenario for charitable services in which shelters or foster care agencies could also be forced to violate their own principles or shut down. What is the impact of that?
Yes. So we've, again, seen this at the state level.
There's a theme here, Monica.
Yes. So in about half a dozen states, there have been faith-based foster care and adoption agencies that were forced to close down because they prefer to place kids in homes with both a married mom and dad. And that was construed falsely as discrimination. This bill would replicate those cases across the country. It could also affect other kinds of charities. There's a case out of Alaska where a women's shelter declined to allow a biological male into a shelter that was for women who had been sexually trafficked and abused. And it's completely understandable why they would want to retain those sex-specific facilities. And so this bill would have dangerous implications.
Monica Burke, Research Assistant at the Heritage Foundation's DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks again for having me.
A new study finds nearly half of American Catholics say global mistreatment of Christians is a major problem. Numbers released by Aid to the Church in Need show 46% say worldwide persecution of Christians is, quote, very severe, up 6 points from last year. The poll also asked which country the faithful thinks is the most guilty of mistreatment. Iran was at the top with nearly 22%, followed by Iraq at 17.5%. Up next, analysis of the president's executive order on free speech on college campuses. And an artist has a brush with Pope Francis. The head of a coordinating body for the nation's colleges and universities calls President Trump's executive order, which was announced yesterday, and it tied federal grants to free speech on college campuses, quote, a solution in search of a problem. The American Council on Education president, Ted Mitchell, goes on to say that the order, quote, could lead to unwanted federal micromanagement of the cutting-edge research that is critical to our nation's continued vitality and global leadership. Joining me now to talk about it is Meshell, correspondent, director for campusreform.org. Did I get that right?
Yes, you
Meshell?
did.
Okay, good. Welcome to our program. Your
Thank
group
you.
has done a lot of reporting on this subject, and you say that schools should be held accountable.
Absolutely.
Isn't this hard to enforce?
Well, I do see this as, we're waiting for more details on this executive order, and we are going to be watching very closely how this plays out and holding the president accountable for this.
These just don't happen. These executive orders, then things have to happen in order to put these in place. What are you hearing from students around the country when it comes to the equal enforcement of free speech for conservative voices?
Yes, well, I work with hundreds of students across the country with the Leadership Institute's campus reform, and the thing that we hear time and time again is that the conservative point of view is being shut down very consistently. And we all saw that video of Hayden Williams being assaulted at Berkeley University, but that's not the only example. We've had students that have been docked for using the term mankind or the term illegal alien in a paper. We've had students facing calls for resignation for believing in Christian values. And time again, we really see that students on these campuses have the attitude that violence and retaliation is acceptable if someone holds an opinion that is not popular.
Well, that certainly isn't true. Is there a concern, though, that this could become a situation that forces Christians to act out?
I don't believe that that will happen with this executive order, but it will be interesting to see how these things play out. Ultimately, the president has made a bold move here in recognizing that there is a problem when it comes to free speech on campuses, and I do commend him for that, for the recognition of that problem, but we will need to monitor closely and see exactly how this plays out, because obviously we do want to have the First Amendment be an important thing on college campuses and enforced just like it was written in the Constitution.
Do you think now that, just tell me your thoughts about how conservative students are treated. You're giving me these individual examples, which are happening everywhere. But if you're looking at universities as a whole, collectively, do you believe that this is a problem on the majority of campuses?
Absolutely. And if you have any doubt about that, I would encourage you to check out campusreform.org. We've been reporting on this for a decade, and there's no shortage of examples here. And it really is from coast to coast, all different manner of universities. This happens on Christian schools. We've reported at Gonzaga University, even Catholic schools. And what really we are seeing here is restriction of free speech and the idea that if you have an unpopular opinion, it's not appropriate to voice that opinion on campus.
Well, the statement by the American Council on Education President Ted Meshell, what he says, he was very clear that free speech is at the heart of academic freedom, but that this order in and of itself is unnecessary and welcome, and as I said earlier, solution in search of a problem. So how is the process that the administration is going to put forward going to roll out, and who is going to be at the table for that?
Well, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. We don't have very many details. It was just signed yesterday. But I do think it's very important to monitor this closely and make sure that we're not restricting freedom of speech or even the freedom of academics to have different opinions on campuses. There should be diversity of opinions. That includes liberal opinions, conservatives, and even libertarians. All people should have a place at the table for that discussion, and that's really what we're pushing for at Campus Reform. We don't need every school to be very conservative or, to go only one direction. We're just looking for people to be able to voice their own opinions and not be afraid of retaliation or even violence.
Something tells me, Emma Meshell, that you are going to be covering this very closely. Thank you so much. Campusreform.org's Emma Meshell.
Thank you.
Finally, tonight, Pope Francis takes part in an initiative to help young people find peace and meaning through creativity and art. The Holy Father met yesterday with a Spanish-American artist and young people in Rome. Look at that. There he is painting one. Let's see what it is. Oh, is that his signature, or is that something else? I actually don't know. The Pope urged youngsters to focus on the positive, always, saying they will make mistakes, but it's better to try and do what's good rather than to stand by and do absolutely nothing. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly who do everything every day to make sure that you get news from a Catholic perspective, we thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and at Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night, and God bless you.